Good afternoon. Um, so, when David asked me to do this, he also said he wanted to showcase some things that isn't the standard kind of stand and discuss kind of thing. So we're going to do something that's a bit more experiential, at least to start us off. I've put in front of you a little mini case about Crocodile Construction. It's a construction company. It's really about a whole bunch of people and the relationship between them. And what I'm going to ask you to do, first as an individual, and then I want you to discuss with 3 or 4 people sitting around you, who is the most reprehensible or awful person in the case, from most to least reprehensible. They're all awful, okay? And I always can tell when you get to certain stages in the case because everybody starts laughing because it's kind of outrageous. But what I want you to do is come up with your own version of it, your own definition or your own ranking. And then in about 10 minutes' time, we'll also do that as a group, give you another 10 minutes or so. And then I want to bring us back together. And I would like your groups to report back to me who you put where. And then I'll ask about why. And we'll talk about why. And then I'll talk about some of what I'm trying to illustrate with this little case. Okay? All right. Any questions, let me know. Otherwise, dive in. So another minute or so, and then we'll turn it over to groups here. So make sure you're ready to discuss. All right. So when you're ready, find a group around you, maybe 3, 4, 5 people. Sometimes easier to work across the row, turn to the people behind you or in front of you, and see if you can come to a group agreement on who is most to least reprehensible or awful here. Okay? And I'll give you about 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll start with the discussion. Okay. Let's come back together, please. Come on back. All right, I rather expect that not every group came to a firm decision on this one, but we'll try to go with what we have. Because I've checked around. There are a number of groups that do have a group ranking, so we'll go with what we've got in the interest of time. And now we've got our 5 characters here, and so we just have a very, very brief kind of what did each one of them do. So what was Abigail guilty of? What did she do that was bad?
Fraud.
Sorry, she?
Fraud.
Fraud. Right. Fraud. Pretty much. Okay. So how about Gregory?
Fraud. Complicit in fraud or corruption.
Okay.
And he didn't help his friends.
And not helping his friend out.
Yeah.
Okay, not helping. He started it. How about Ivan?
Betrayal.
Yeah. Blackmail. Oh, betrayal. Okay, we'll go with that. How about Tony? That's definitely blackmail. You can't get around that one.
Sexual predator.
Yeah.
And Sharon? So, amongst this cavalcade of misbehavior here, let's go ahead and ask a couple groups to share your ranking and a little bit about why you chose. Anybody want to volunteer?
Okay.
Volunteer, great.
So we went with Sharon.
Sharon is the most reprehensible.
Yeah, because she's an arsonist and she could easily kill somebody.
Okay. And then who did you follow with?
Oh, not popular decision.
Not everybody agrees.
And then we followed it with Tony, because he's
Okay.
he's a blackmailer and a sexual predator.
Okay.
And then we went with Abigail, who's a fraudster, and she was a bit nasty at the end when she laughed.
She's not that funny. Okay.
She was a bit nasty. And then we went with Gregory, who was disloyal and a cheat, but didn't actually do anything illegal, I guess.
Yes, he did.
Well, he was listed for, but he didn't. I mean, he wasn't in a position of power and that. Anyway, so
Okay.
that's why we put him there. And then
Okay.
we put Ivan as the most adorable character. On the basis that he did try to not get involved, and then once involved, he was disloyal or a bit of a coward. But actually, he is probably obliged to have done what he did on the basis of his contracts anyway.
Right. Okay. So what would you say your overall kind of framework is for making these decisions?
We don't want to know any of the other
Of
I
course,
think we
but
went with legal in the end. Well, we went with legal and also the amount of harm, the degree of harm that they caused. So ultimately, Sharon got, top score on the basis that she could have taken human life.
all right.
Threats of
So
human life.
legal and harm doing as the principle.
Yeah.
And she
Okay.
backtracked it.
All right. We have some, I know this group over here has a very different view of
It's
this.
a different approach.
So why don't you share your approach?
Yeah, we'll share our approach. So we took a more kind of backdrop. They all have personal back history. Were friends many years ago, so some of the judgments were, very kind of tedious given that backdrop. But Tony's one was kind of, the act was disgusting, I guess, and he kind of just really took advantage of a situation with kind of only one agenda at play.
Okay. All right. So what was you next?
We chose Ivan.
Yeah, Ivan.
Ivan is number 2.
Yeah, Ivan number 2 because he sort of refused to get involved at the beginning, and if he had wanted to do the right thing, he should have, gone to the authorities at the beginning. But then he just used it to his advantage and betrayed an old friend. So not only did he not help her out, he also didn't do the right thing, and he only did it when there was something in it for him, and it put
Okay.
her in a terrible situation.
All right. Number 3.
Then we went with Gregory because it started between him and Abigail. It started with Gregory, but Gregory was in a position to help Abigail,
Mm-hmm.
and he chose not to, considering that Abigail had got through this mess by helping him. From a moral point of view, then he should have really tried to help her regardless of whether she could pay back or not.
Right. So there's a lack of return.
Yeah.
Okay. And then who'd you go with next?
Then I think we went with Abigail.
Abigail was number 4.
So I guess Abigail was no remorse, but the reason why she's kind of low on the list and not high is she was trying to do a favour, but it wasn't kind of spiteful and horrible. And it was the action itself was fraud. I get it, legally bad, but it was kind of in the interest of helping someone who was struggling. So morally, it kind of had rationality. And Sharon was just nuts. So
Nuts, and it was reasonable payback.
yeah, it was payback. So you'd want her on your side.
Okay.
Sharon's good.
There you go. It's possible to have the same person either first or last.
It's a photo
Okay.
finish, right?
To be fair, my initial ranking was almost exactly the same. And then
Yeah.
I immediately, when I wrote down the reasons, rescored it.
Yeah, and why? Why did you do that?
Because, firstly, I noticed that I probably had a male-female bias.
Okay.
And when I wrote down the reasons, I realised that I had a bias towards personal and betrayal and softer reasons rather than the legal, more tangible.
Right.
What are the implications of things they've done?
Okay. But why did you change your mind? What was it? What was the trigger?
It was looking at the reasons for the ranking. When I wrote down the reasons.
When you wrote them down, you thought, oh,
Yeah.
maybe this isn't really the right. Okay.
It's really,
Um,
sorry,
yeah.
it's really interesting
Oh,
to
sorry.
have the exact same ranking as that group, but then I got persuaded by my group in consensus to change some of the rankings.
Yeah,
Okay. So where did you end up? If you started off like this, where did you end up?
We went for Gregory, Tony, Abigail, Sharon.
So Gregory,
Tony.
Tony,
Abigail,
Abigail up here, yep.
Sharon,
Sharon
and I.
and Ivan. Okay.
And we had 2 people here who had exactly the same mind. It
Okay.
was mostly based on empathy. I think ours
Yeah,
was
it's
a bit,
more
all it's cause and consequence. We thought a lot of the actions were based on empathy. Sharon's were a bit much in terms of leverage. Yeah, it was all based on empathy, and we based our ranking mostly on empathy and compassion.
Yeah, there are at least 3 ways in which you can rank this, or 3 very clear and distinct principles. One principle has to do with, as we've seen, with the law. Who's the biggest legal offender here? A second one has to do with taking advantage of personal gain, which I think is more closer to what's going on here. And then a third one, which I think may also be implicated here, maybe even in this one, is about the coercive use of power. When you're in a position of power, do you exercise it for your own personal kind of gain, as it were? This is all stuff based in values. So one group even took, immediately figured out, you come in here thinking about discussing the case. What I really want to discuss is not the case. What I really want to discuss is what happened in your group. Because conflict comes from several sources. And there's some fairly or relatively easier stuff. If we have different points of view and different information, you learn to share, exchange information. We all think of groups in that way. Okay? Secondly, it turns out to be whatever you win, I lose, and it's essentially a negotiation. Okay? But the one that really gets difficult is when it's based in values. These are basic, do you go for legal or empathy? Okay? There's no right answer here. And when pressed, this turns into what we call a backstop value discussion. Just ask people why. Why? Why? And you'll come very quickly to, within a few questions of why, to I can't explain it. It just is what it is. It's your backstop. It's what you value in life. That kind of conflict, incredibly difficult. Okay? And I want to talk a little bit more about, some of those types of conflicts and the kind of things that probably are, things you can use or strategies you can use to try to deal with some of those. But before I do that, I'm just curious, for those of you particularly who changed your mind, okay? Why did you change your mind? Was it just a kind of give out? I don't want to have the argument. Or did you change your mind because you were genuinely persuaded or you didn't see another point? Yeah.
In our group, we had a dynamic where one person felt very, very strongly, even said at the beginning, that person said, I feel really strongly about ranking Sharon at this point. And then there was a discussion around, within the middle, there wasn't really much difference between them. And the idea was to come to consensus. So we sort of came to consensus around it. Because that was the task, and none of us felt very strongly about how the middle people ranked, I think. Is that, would that be?
And I think I was also persuaded by the argument.
But the first part of what I heard is we went by who felt strongest as the starting point. If somebody feels particularly strongly about something when it's a values-based conflict, and it's okay, not really my values, but it's not central to my identity, we give way to the person whose values are implicated and central to their identity. And that's one way to resolve values-based conflict, okay? But it does require other people to essentially capitulate to the other person, okay? And that may or may not be possible. It may be possible that you've got two people for whom it's central to their identity, okay? And then you've got to think of, again, how do I deal with that? Was there anybody or any group that had a bit more difficult conversation, perhaps? Yeah?
Well, ours wasn't difficult. We actually, two of us got exactly the same as the first comment there to start off with.
Yeah.
But then we talked to the group and we looked at the frame of what we were discussing. Was it criminal or was it moral, effectively? And because you've got the most offensive is more of a kind of moral judgment. So we decided to take that as the frame to look at this through rather than the criminal, which we started off on. So the criminal was the 3, 4, 5, 2, 1.
Yeah.
And kind of turned it on the head apart from the lunatic Sharon. And maybe more
Okay.
changed, not because of conflict or conflict resolution, just because of how we played this.
Is it
judgment out of it and made it a sort of definition-based conversation.
okay? Well, what you've done is another one of these, which is let's define a principle that we can all be okay with. It's not exactly my principle, but it's actually okay with me. And that's another way to think in terms of resolving conflict that's values-based in particular, is you have two groups or two individuals, and you want to figure out how to deal with the conflict between them. You try to figure out what actually joins them, okay? I mean, it's exactly the same at the organizational level. When you have, all corporate merger, the typical response is usually the person who's got the loudest voice or the organization that's biggest. Their instinct is to crush the little one, okay? The problem with that is the harder you crush the little one, the more you turn it into a perfectly formed diamond that is able to resist all attempts to cut through, okay? At the national level, the biggest mistake any British Prime Minister makes is attacking one of the identities of the constituent nations. You know, think about the Scottish referendum. What's the biggest mistake and the biggest problem for the Prime Minister? How do I draw attention to a British identity that doesn't undermine the Scottish identity if you want to get them to vote for the joint identity, which is British? Okay? It's exactly the same thing at the individual level. How do I get people to see what does actually connect them? Can we create a construct that isn't exactly purely one or the other, but one we can all be okay with? Okay? So that's another way of attacking the kind of values-based conflict problem. Yeah?
I think that what we did is we had disagreements within our group. And we decided to set up, to compare individuals against two criteria, law and morality. And we discussed that law would prevail over morality because just we have different opinions on some of the individuals. This is how we came.
Okay. Yeah, sometimes it's helpful just to map it out. And sometimes people make quite complex trade-offs. We're going to weight the legal with this weighting, and we're going to weight the moral with this weighting, and then we're going to evaluate each of them and have a formula for the rank ordering, which is a form of compromise between the two sets of values. It's another way of dealing with kind of the really difficult values-based kind of conflict. Yeah? So there are some strategies out there. And I guess I also want to I want to talk about a few other things to do with conflict, and I will go to the board here if you don't mind. Because we've been talking about conflict as though perhaps it's a bad thing. But the question is it? So if you look at conflict and performance at the team level, what is the relationship between those two things? Is it conflict is a bad thing? If you're saying no, then what would you suggest?
It's a good thing as long as you can agree to disagree and come together through the conflict and ultimately resolve that conflict together on a common aim. If you think about a rugby team or a high-performing corporate team, you can have a lot of conflict, but ultimately you have to settle on a common aim.
Right, so you're making a suggestion that looks like so. More is good.
There's sort of maybe a plateau.
There may be a plateau to it.
It follows that.
Okay.
Squiggly.
And what we're describing here is what I would call task, conflict, debate, discussion. We have different points of view. We got to figure out how to try to resolve this difference, okay, in some way, shape, or form. And it's right. You want something middling. Okay, if you're not having any discussion or debate, you're actually not dealing with the issues. On the other hand, let's say you can't even agree terminology. Okay, you're going to be unlikely to come to a sensible decision there either. So something in the middle. Okay, and that would be right. This is what research shows, is that a degree of debate and discussion is a good and healthy thing for a team. Okay? However, the problem with that is this. In every real-world group we've ever looked at this, task conflict is highly correlated with, so can we do a different one? Relationship conflict. Okay, and that is negative affect, I hate you. Okay? And that's what kind of sits behind a lot of people's reservations about conflict, is it can create, you know, the poison pill of every group, and indeed, it does that. Okay? And every real world group we've ever looked at, and that it ranges from teams all over the world at different levels, the average correlation is positive 0.7 to 0.8. So as a team leader, we often think, right, my team needs to be having a debate. Conflict discussion is a good thing. What I am doing is moving my team up the performance curve. What may I actually be doing? I may actually be doing that if you're not very careful, okay? So the question really is not, should we have conflict? It's about how we deal with the conflicts that emerge and where you can extract value without the damaging side, the negative affect, relationship conflict, I hate you stuff. And there are some answers here, okay? This is work I've been doing over the last kind of 25 years. And we have some pretty clear answers, I think. First thing to know probably isn't a big surprise, which is when you have a high degree of trust amongst teammates, that correlation actually drops to right at about 0, which means I can drive it this way without driving it that way. Okay? So trust is the obvious gold dust for every team. Probably kind of sort of figured that out to some degree. Okay? Probably already knew that at one level. Here's the problem with that. How accurately can you assess the level of trust in your team? Okay, and I've done this studies, by the way, looking at teams and team leaders. What would you expect the correlation to be if I have my team here, and I'm the team leader, and I'm evaluating conflict? How accurate am I at predicting what they're going to tell me about the level of intergroup conflict between them?
Depends how long you've been working with them.
Yeah, although I've been looking at things like top teams and boards that have been working together for years, okay? Even there, what would you expect?
I think it's probably quite low,
Yeah, like what?
40%.
Yeah, maybe 0.4? Yeah, okay. On average?
I think it depends on the team. I mean, are they all more or less on the same level doing a certain job? Or are we got a board where everyone's got massive egos and got different, dynamics are different.
Yeah.
But you can have like more or less people doing the same sort of goal, the same sort of level within the team. That's a very different thing than a very high performing board.
Yeah. No, point taken. But most of the studies show, on average, the correlation between what the team leader says and everybody else, 0. Okay? That's a frightening idea. Okay? As a team leader, and here's the problem. I have a dyadic relationship with each of these 3 people, which are good and fine. I assume they're all fine with each other. And because they have every incentive not to display the fact that they hate each other to me. Okay? It may break out in the open at some point, but most of the time, each of them doesn't want to reveal the problem between them because it might also reflect poorly on them. So I go along my way, assuming everything's fine, when in actual fact, these 2 are trying to stab each other in the back. Okay? So, the short answer is, if you want to have a good debate, make sure your team trusts each other. The problem is it's very difficult to assess and almost impossible to get into a group where they don't already feel it. So a lot of people making a lot of money, sending teams off out into the out of doors to learn to fall back and trust each other. And the evidence for that is poor at best. Okay? Poor to non-existent.
It's a lot of that to do with the fact that people generally shy away from conflict and skirt around, dance around their handbags. They don't want to get into the uncomfortable debate.
Oh, and there's really some cultural issues around that. Sometimes that's the problem, but not always. The problem with the outdoor kind of adventure stuff and building trust is that if I learn to trust you falling back in the woods, has virtually nothing to do with trust in the office. Okay, these are over completely different issues. And trust is domain specific. So unless you're doing something that's work-oriented, building trust is unlikely to be essentially bootstrapped in from the outside with that kind of activity. So then the question remains, then, okay, if I'm not sure how much trust there really is, what can I do? Okay, and there are some ideas here and things we've been looking at over the last, decade or so. And the short answer has to do with how you work together and how decisions are made. Okay, so I'll talk you through some very specific things, but the most important stuff I want to mention here has to do with how decisions are taken, because that's actually quite central to the problem. So first, and these are going to be in a particular order. So first alternative has to do with what I would call qualified consensus, which is everybody says they can live with it. Okay? Consensus, everybody says, yes, that's the right answer. And in the real world, that usually takes too long. Okay? Or is extremely difficult, particularly if it's values-based, in order to achieve. So you can achieve something called qualified consensus, which is everybody says it's not a dumb idea. Okay, I'm not fundamentally opposed. So option A, B, and C, I want A, she wants B. If we can agree that B is not crazy, even if C is, then we can at least proceed on B. Does that make sense? So that actually works reasonably well. Next one, leader decide. As a team leader, I've heard all the arguments. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this call. This is the decision I'm going to take. Generally works okay. Qualified consensus is better. But the reason it works is, again, going back to the dyadic relationships between me and each of the members of my team. They have an incentive, even if they disagreed with me, to maintain a work relationship with me as the senior person on the team or as the boss. So you can maintain a degree of relationship there, and it works okay. And then there's broadly a third option. Comes by different words, but some form of voting, majority rule. Everybody put your hand up, and whoever gets the biggest number of votes wins. Problem with this is we have a team here and we vote, and it's 3-1. And this happens very quickly in many teams because we quickly figure out we're more or less on the same page. And she's not, and we don't want to talk about it anymore. We got lots to do. Call for a vote, shut her down, done. Okay? That happens way too often out there. Now, what is her incentive to cooperate now? Slim to none. Okay? And she's not necessarily going to say nana nana boo boo when it fails, but she's definitely going to be thinking it.
Might even be sabotage.
At worst form, she might sabotage. At best form, when it happens, you kind of stand there and say, it's God's will, it happened.
I can always set fire to it.
Yeah, there you go. And we've been finding this over and over and over in the work that I've been doing. This really doesn't work. The whole you're far better off, trust, and you probably need some outside help if you really want to be sure about trust. Anonymous surveys and outsiders can sometimes be very helpful with this. If you're not sure, some form of qualified consensus, declare this up front, usually works, because most of the time people will not stop something unless and if they're that firmly opposed, there's probably an important reason why. And you better make sure you understand that reason, because even if they're not quite right, there's probably something to it. Which is why you can go to a leader decide, but if you do, you better explore that objection very carefully first. Okay, because what groups are particularly good at is making sure you don't make a mistake. Groups, there's no better way. There's a reason why presidents have cabinets and prime ministers have a team around them and so on, and it's because the stakes are high. Okay, and what team can really help you with is make sure you don't do something that's like, oh, I can't believe we made that mistake after the fact. Yeah.
Are we talking about trust specifically in the context of is this the right company decision versus trust that you're not going to say screw me over with my boss, or because it feels like they're kind of different. I can't imagine that those things would help me trust my boss or my other colleagues aren't going to screw me over. But it feels like they would more lead me trusting the direction.
Yeah, here's the problem with trust. Trust comes in 3 different forms, and there's oftentimes misunderstanding about it. One form is what's called behavioral integrity. So you say you're going to do it, do you do it? Okay? Or not. Second form, benevolence. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure that you're okay when I'm in the power. Third is competence-based. So, you can promise whatever you like, but can you actually deliver it? Okay? And we can all agree, here's the problem with any kind of diversity in a team. We can all agree up front very straightforwardly that trust with our customers, key. No problem. That's not the hard part. The hard part is, what does it actually mean in actual behavior and enactment? We're about to launch our next product, and we find a problem. Now, if my version of trust is behavioral integrity, you launch anyway, because you've announced that date. Now, you may have to work to have a fix or a patch later of some form, but you're going to launch. If you're benevolence-based, you would definitely not launch, because that's not taking care of our customer. Okay? Now we have a big clash. Okay? Agreeing kind of very high-level stuff is easy. What does it actually mean on the ground is really hard. And that's also the problem in values-based conflict, is people can pitch it at one level, but what does it actually mean? What behavior do we engage in? But it's also sometimes the way you can address the problem too, because it may mean the same behaviors can be interpreted differently depending upon a different set of values. But there's a big difference between values and behavior, and it can work against you, it can work for you if you work it right. Yeah?
That's a follow-up question. I just wanted to replay it back. So I was really struggling with the idea that the sort of away day thing didn't lead to trust. Would you say it did in those other dimensions of trust? Because it feels like dialogue is the way that I always build trust with people, and that's just a situation in which you need to have better dialogue.
Yeah, you need to, really great facilitation that will actually bring it back to the workplace makes it plausible. But so much of what goes on is just, if I learn to fall back and you're going to pick me up or not let me fall and kill myself, does that translate into whether I trust you in the office? The short answer is not likely. You need really good facilitation to get from, why does that trust have anything to do with this trust, and what's actually behind that? Unfortunately, it's not enough good facilitation out there. But this is where, all of those kind of activities and experiential learning, the money is always in the debrief, never in the activity. I can keep you busy and keep you entertained. Okay, that's actually easy. Lots of people can do it. Can we draw something out of it that's meaningful and important is what really matters. And that's where a lot of this stuff goes off the rails. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to relate a story on that point about your outward bound thing. I was part of an advertising group that came together with another advertising group, and there was a lot of debate about whether we should spend a lot of money on outward bound, sort of falling back into each other's arms to build trust between these businesses. And somebody said, why don't we build a bar in the reception of the building? Because actually that builds a lot more trust, because people will, as they're going out of the door, go and speak to each other in the evenings and talk to each other over a beer, and it really worked. And it was a specific response to this thing about, if you try and do this in an artificial way, it's not, the building of trust between lots of teams is not going to work.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. That's a much better use of your time and money to build a bar and reception, probably, believe it or not. I've got a couple of things for you here, because we're about at the end of the time here. There's lots more we could talk about. One of which is just the summary of how you can evaluate these people and what criteria that I mentioned, if that is of interest. And then secondly, I'm going to hand out a set of kind of messages when I teach this case, will typically come out in our discussion, most of which has, even in this brief conversation here. So I'll pass them back as well. So, and I will point out also a couple of other things on here. On the front page, it talks about this distinction between task and relationship conflict that we talked about. Also process conflict, how will we make those decisions? Short answer is related to what I talked about in terms of making decisions is, do it first. Agree process before you get into content. You'll get a much better outcome. People sometimes find it difficult, but you'll get a better outcome. It goes on to talk about where conflict comes from and how to make decisions. So qualified consensus versus leader decide and majority rule. Where conflict comes from is at the bottom of the page. Now, if you turn it over, this is the stuff we haven't had as much time to talk about, but I'll just briefly mention. One is on conflict resolution in teams. So teams perform best when you are preemptive. You anticipate the conflict that might emerge, and It's focused on what's good for the team as opposed to dealing with individual quirks and preferences. Okay? So a real world example here. One of my very best friends from primary school onward is many years ago, he was a consultant in one of the big consultancies, and I saw his letter of engagement, which was all about, here are the issues that we're going to be dealing with this client. Here are the way we're going to resolve any conflict that might emerge between the people holding the budget and the people dealing with the report and the people, and we're going to deal with it in this way. And here's how we're going to resolve these kind of conflicts. I remember at the time thinking, this is 25, 30 years ago, thinking, that's a lot of process up front. Really curious whether that was going to be helpful. I've spent the last 25 years, and every time I keep coming back to the same thing. All that process talk up front, hugely beneficial. Okay? So it is worthwhile to do those kind of things. So be preemptive, anticipate your conflict, and talk about things that matter to the whole group. And then down at the bottom, you got a few other things that are coming out of the research as well. Defining success criteria, for example, needs to be very carefully defined before you begin. Both affective and economic or financial outcomes matter. What do you want people to feel like at the end of the project is as important as what's the bottom line of the project. And it resolves a lot of miscommunication about how we actually go about the business. For example, and I can keep going, and then last one, which I will mention, is if the team needs to operate virtually, start in person first, please. It's all about building relationships in those unscripted moments. You can go to virtual, but you really should start in person. And again, lots of research showing over and over how important this is in a team. Okay? Which is also one of the big benefits of coming together for all kinds of development and training. It's as much about building a cohort as it is about what you're actually learning in the classroom. Both of those are very important things. All right, lots more we could talk about, but I think I've overstayed my welcome. If you have any other questions or you want to know more about some of these kind of issues, do feel free to email me or get in touch. I'll be delighted to talk to you. All right. Thank you.